Before the Civil War, slavery was prominent in America. Slavery was one of the main parts of the economy in America. Also, there are many more slaves in the South rather than the North. Slaves usually were used for farm work and chores, but their living conditions weren't that good, and most of the time they were mistreated. Eventually, in 1861, there are two sides of America: the Union and the Confederacy. The Union was against slavery, while the Confederacy was with slavery. It was a long war with many casualties on both sides, but on April 9th, 1865, the Union won the war. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States of America, signed the 15th, 16th, and 17th Amendments to abolish slavery.
With the new amendments, slavery was abolished, but black people were still treated harshly. Instead of slavery, black people were segregated. Segregation was everywhere. There were segregated schools, drinking fountains, bathrooms, gas stations, restaurants, buses, etc. Black people also had worse education. Because of segregation, black people had worse jobs and worse living conditions. It was better than slavery, but not nearly as good as it was for white people. Black people would be called racial slurs and would get brutally attacked. If black people tried to fight back in defense, the police would attack them, and the black people would probably get put in jail or even executed. An example of this happening to someone was Emmett Till. Emmett Till met a woman at a grocery store, and he was accused of flirting with, touching, and whistling at the woman. Several nights later, the woman's husband and his brother abducted Emmett Till, beat, and mutilated him before shooting him in the head, ripping out his testicles, and then drowning him in the Tallahatchie River.
Black people were fed up with their horrible segregation and racism in general, so they started a movement to stop racism, segregation, and all the things that were happening to them. And thus was born the Civil Rights Movement. Claudette Colvin is one of the first examples of colored people standing up to racism. On March 2nd, 1955, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old, took the bus home from high school. The bus was filling up, and soon there were no spots left. Eventually, a white person entered the full bus and saw Claudette in a white seat. She was fine, but when the police came to get her off the bus, she started kicking and screaming and caused a scene. This was big because all of the other people who refused to give up their seats on the bus would quietly take their fine and leave. Claudette was different. This set things into motion, and 9 months later, Rosa Parks was thrown into jail because she refused to give up her seat. This was the start of the Montgomery bus boycott. There were multiple other small protests that happened, and eventually there was a combined power that really started the Civil Rights Movement.
Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. Martin Luther King Jr. was a civil rights activist that used peaceful protest to do what he wanted to have done. He gave speeches, and he had people do boycotts and strikes. He also had people do marches and sit-ins. Probably the most effective one of those tactics was speeches, because his speeches were put on the news and they were broadcasted everywhere in the United States. Probably his most famous speech was his I Have a Dream speech. His I Have a Dream speech was one of the most important things that he did before he got assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. also got put in jail. He and his friend Reverend Abernathy were put in jail because they led peaceful protests against unconstitutional bans on race mixing in Birmingham in 1963. They got put in Birmingham. He also led the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, where he had all of the people of color not ride the bus until the bus drivers let them have equal rights on the bus. Because most of the passengers were people of color, so they weren't getting enough money because nobody was riding the buses. So they had to change the rules so that people of color could sit wherever they wanted instead of having to sit in the back and having to move if a white person wanted to sit where they were sitting. Martin Luther King Jr. also had his house bombed when he was protesting, and his wife and daughter barely got in time, and luckily they were not harmed. Martin Luther King is a very important figure in today, and if it hadn't been for Martin Luther King, it would not be the same today. On March 29, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis, Tennessee to support the black sanitation workers that lived there. And then on April 3rd, he went to give his I've Been to the Mountaintop speech at Basin Temple. The next day, at 6:01 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was shot by James Earl Ray on the balcony of Lorraine Motel. The bullet entered through his right cheek, then smashing his jaw, then traveling down his spinal cord, and then lodged in his shoulder. When everyone found out he was assassinated, there were many riots. It was clear that people were mad. The media would talk about the riots and Martin Luther King Jr. All of this brought more attention to the civil rights movement. Eventually, in 1968, black people were granted equal rights and America became desegregated. Martin Luther King Jr. played a major role in the civil rights movement. He was a turning point in the civil rights movement. If Martin Luther King Jr. had been killed earlier, the United States could still be segregated today. But because of the civil rights movement, America has changed. There is no longer slavery or segregation. Black people can go to school, they can go on the bus, they can do pretty much anything white people can do and be judged the same. This is all possible because of Martin Luther King Jr. Back in the early to mid-1900s, white people would beat up black people. Now white people hug black people. In the mid-1900s, white people would throw racial slurs at black people. Now white and black people compliment each other. Back in the 1900s, white people would kill black people. Now you can see white people trusting their lives in the hands of black people. All of this is because of the civil rights movement. Kids can go to preschool, kindergarten, elementary school, high school, and even college, no matter what their race is. Black people can receive the same level of education as white people. I believe that America has changed, and it has changed for the better. And it changed for the better because of Martin Luther King. Without Martin Luther King, this would have never happened. Martin Luther King was a huge turning point in the civil rights movements